welcome. I am excited today to talk about neighborhoods in transition, development and community, and community self-determination. Before we do that, I just want to give a big thank you to our supporting sponsor, the Incarnate Word Foundation, which supports these community forums by Focus St. Louis. We very, very much appreciate their support. Now, in St. Louis, neighborhoods form the unique tapestry of our region. Many of these neighborhoods are in transition, whether they're dealing with population loss or gain, rapid gentrification, or vacancy and dereliction. But who's making the decisions about the future of these communities? There are a variety of ways in which a neighborhood can organize to influence the shape of their own community, including neighborhood associations, community development corporations, and creating strategic plans built on neighborhood needs. To talk about centering that community voice in the difficult triad that is development, that often includes the residents at one end of the triangle, developers at the other, and of course, government and regulatory agencies at the third, that community voice piece is really what we want to focus on today. And to do that, we have brought together an eminent panel of guests who I'm going to go ahead and invite to turn on their cameras at this point. I'm going to give brief introductions. You can get their full bios at the event website. Joining us in alphabetical order this afternoon are Julia Allen, a co-founder of the For the Ville organization, Annissa McCaskill, executive director of the Dutchtown South Community Corporation, Vontriece McDowell, neighborhood solidarity partner with Invest STL, Angela Pinex, the executive director of the Spanish Lake Community Development Corporation, and Trina Thompson, West End resident and board member of the Cornerstone Corporation. Welcome, all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. So I'm going to throw out one first question because the thing about neighborhoods, as I said, they form a tapestry because they're all unique. We have representatives from 4 different neighborhoods in transition here today, but none of these neighborhoods is in the exact same state of transition or even undergoing the same kind of transition. So to begin today, I'd like to ask each of our panelists from a neighborhood organization to describe what kind of transition state your neighborhood finds itself in. Is this a new transition, one that's been going on for years, a transition due to loss of population or influx of population? Are you struggling with gentrification or simply trying to organize a community that until now has not had a collective voice? Who would like to start on that one?
I'll start.
Thank you, Julia. After you.
Okay. I would say that the Ville and the Greater Ville neighborhoods have always been neighborhoods in transition. And basically, you know, even though we've lost population over the years, if you look at the history of the Ville neighborhoods, you can see that the history basically began in the 1800s when the Ville neighborhood was designated as one of the few neighborhoods in which African Americans lived in. And then if you move on to the 1920s, it began to change again. And that's when you started to see things like restricted covenants come up, where they restricted African Americans from buying property within certain boundaries outside of the Ville. And then in the 1930s, that's when you have the building of Homer G. Phillips Hospital, which served as a basic economic engine in the neighborhood. And it also brought a great influx of African Americans from different social economic statuses, because it was one of 2 only training hospitals in the city of St. Louis. And then if you move on to the 40s, and you see where the white population that was located within the Ville, they started to move out, either move further west or south. That's what, you know, they can label it white flight. And then if you move into the 50s through the 70s, you start to see Black flight. And a lot of that had to do with policy change and things like that. And one of the significant things that had basically happened in the 70s was the closing of the Homer G. Phillips Hospital, which is located at 2601 North Whittier, and it will always be located at 2601 North Whittier. That is where the history is. That is where the history is going to be forever. So if we move on to the 80s, there's I don't know if many of you have heard of Jack Saunders. Jack Saunders was, he is now a retired HUD advisor. What Jack Saunders did, he came into the neighborhood and he worked with former Alderwoman Daisy McFarland and Fred Robinson and the Ville Historic Preservation Organization to help get the Ville neighborhood designated as a local historic district. And from that work that they did over the years, wasn't a whole lot being done. But what happened in the late 2000s was that Thomasina Clark and myself and Aaron Williams went to the CATS training program, the Community Arts Training Program. And so we learned that you can use arts and culture in the development of neighborhoods. So we got a small grant from the Regional Arts Commission, and we had a community billboard contest where we invited the community artists to come in and design a billboard for us. We weren't very organized then. It was maybe about 5 or 6 of us, but we were doing the work. And so we sent out this RFP to get people interested in participating in this community art project. So the end of that project, we ended up with 2 billboards on St. Louis Avenue. One is designating the people of the Ville, and the other one is a designation of the Sumner High School, past, present, and future. And so we, I think the Ville is always going to be a neighborhood in transition. I hope so. Because if you stop transitioning, then you're stopping growth, you're stopping development. And we love transition. And I've been here 72 years, so I've seen some of that transition.
I appreciate that perspective. A lot of people see transition and change as something you want to move through to get to some other end state. But the idea of, if a neighborhood's not in transition, it's not adapting to what's going on. That's a really interesting, powerful point. Who wants to follow up next on that one? Annissa, looks like you've...
Yeah, I am muted. I'll go next. So the name of our organization, Dutchtown South, is a bit of a misnomer because we actually cover 4 neighborhoods in South St. Louis City, encompassing about 10% of the city's population. And so I think that we're a good indicator of how things have shifted and changed in the 49, almost 50 years that we've been around. At the beginning of the organization, you would say that South City was predominantly a white area with pockets of African-American community that have been there at this point for generations. And now what we see in the population that we're servicing and interacting in is that we have a large immigrant refugee population, as well as a large African-American population. And so that has been the trend. And as we move forward, we have been engaging in a matter of shifting, not just doing the housing equity work that we've always done, or the affordable housing work that we've always done, but to look at housing through a racial and economic equity lens, which has been necessary due to the populations that we're servicing. In addition, we have an environmental justice component that we've now had to engage, because we know that where poor people are, where immigrants and where people of color are, those tend to be the places that people who are affluent, or industries that are affluent, tend to dump or tend to put their waste because they don't want it where they live. So in these last few years, a large component of what we have had to engage upon and start to do is to move not only from affordable housing into housing equity, but now also into environmental justice. And the lens that we see that through is that you can't live somewhere and not address these other things. One of the things that we are also concerned about is the gentrification that's going on around us in other neighborhoods. We are one of the few places that people still can buy a house in St. Louis City. We're also one of the few places that people can rent affordably in St. Louis City. And how do we encourage development without stymieing and pushing out people who have been here for generations? So those are the transitions that we see, and those are the juggling and the things that we are engaging in and trying to address in a means that is safe and welcoming to everyone.
Not just one transition, but multiple transitions at a time.
Right.
Absolutely. Good point. Trina, you look like you are queued up.
Yeah, I thought I'd just jump in right now. So the interesting thing is that as I listen to Annissa and listen to Julia, a lot of similarities from a historical perspective. But I think Julia hit it right on the head when she said that if a neighborhood is not in transition, that in and of itself would be a problem. Because the world is ever changing, families are growing, people are moving in, people are moving out. So you are always in a state of transition. So I really appreciate you, Julia, for lifting that up. So the West End neighborhood, which is where I reside and where Cornerstone is based, is in this little corner of, I call it a corner, it's not really a corner, but when people talk a lot about the city of I'm not from St. Louis, but when a lot of people talk about the city of St. Louis, they always distinguish North versus South. And now we have this coined phrase of the Delmar divide. So the West End neighborhood is in that corner where we're immediately north of that Delmar divide, but we're at the farthest west of the city that you can go. And so we are bordered by Skinker, DeBolivar, and Union as far as our west and east, and then Delmar to Page. The interesting thing about even mentioning the Delmar divide, and as even Annissa was mentioning racial and economic equity, there's been a lot of conversations about that during this pandemic, right? I mean, it's been kind of lifted up, resurfaced, if you will, because for many of us, it's always been there, but for some folks, it's a new conversation, right? So, but what it has brought is a lot of people coming in with new opportunities. And because of where the West End is located and situated, it becomes like a prime spot for some of these opportunities. The challenge is when you're presenting those opportunities to a neighborhood that does not have a collective vision, oftentimes the people that are less engaged and involved in those decisions are the people that are going to be most impacted, and that's the residents. So I would say that for the West End, the transition that we're in is lifting up community voice, going through a community planning process so that what's at the forefront of any development that goes on in the West End are the needs, the priorities, the desires of the people that live here. And so we are joined with Visitation Park neighborhood, which is also in that boundary that I mentioned, where we're engaging in a collective process to get the voices of all of our neighbors engaged to plan for our future, to develop a shared vision for our neighborhoods. Also realizing too that even within the West End and Visitation Park neighborhoods, depending on which corner you're standing on, the needs are different. The challenges are different. I will say that we're probably most impacted by vacancy, as well as gentrification from the perspective of, there's two things I think about when we say gentrification. One is trying to heal from the racial inequities that have existed, that have caused just a myriad of challenges for neighborhoods like ours, but also displacement, whether it's real or not. There's a lot of fear around displacement when you start to see people coming in to neighborhoods or developments happening in neighborhoods. And it's a real thing that has to be at the forefront of any conversations that we have in the West End. But I would definitely lift that up as one of the challenges that we're definitely struggling with within our neighborhoods.
Thank you, Trina. Yeah, the West End is definitely in a liminal space, kind of between a lot of other things, a lot of pressures, and the idea that you have gentrification and vacancy in the same neighborhood and dealing with both of those problems shows how complex this is in the city. But of course, that's not just in the city, right, Angela? So let's open up to you.
Hi, I'm Angela, and I represent the people of Spanish Lake, Missouri. It is difficult to go behind you ladies that I'm going behind, but I definitely want to go before Vontriece. She's a dynamic speaker and very passionate about the work that she does. So let me slide in here real quick before. Spanish Lake it's a little bit, the county is a little bit different, of course, than the city. And Spanish Lake is in an unincorporated area of the northeast corridor of St. Louis County. So we're home to about 18,000 folks and about 7,000 households. So if Spanish Lake was a municipality or city, it would, so it's a fairly large area to be unincorporated. It would be like the 6th largest city or municipality in the county. It is, where 56% of our housing units are rental, and we are about 80%, at last census, 80% African American. So we're bound by 270 on the south, and on the west, Highway 367, and then the northern and eastern boundaries are actually the Missouri and the Mississippi River. So our boundaries are distinguished by one zip code, and Spanish Lake. So, you know, that's how we're kind of, that's how we are distinct from other communities. We don't share that zip code with any other municipality or city, and all of Spanish Lake is in that one zip code. So I would say, if we're talking about transitioning, we are planning, as Spanish Lake is transitioning to be a destination place, with the globally recognized St. Louis Zoo coming to and expanding into Spanish Lake, where the hope is that we're no longer like the flyover or the passover from folks going to and from Illinois, but actually coming through Spanish Lake as a destination place. So, and then also what we're finding is at each census take, our percentage of rental units are increasing. So at last count in 2010, we were at 52%. So now we're at 56%. And it's, so saying that is not a, saying that a community can't thrive with renters. I'm a renter myself, so I wouldn't say that, but we do know that most for people of color, their wealth is tied into their homes, into their property. So if you have a community that is 80% Black and 56% rental, we know that the health of the balance sheets of those households is not as great as some of our counterparts. So while we are planning to take advantage and leverage the hopefully more that great economic engine of the St. Louis Zoo, we also need to prepare that many of the people that live in Spanish Lake do not own that property, and the people that have that property and own that property are not members of the community. And most of them live outside of the community, and many of them live outside of the state. So so while we just completed a town center plan, a master plan, a land use plan, which we definitely need. We've been assessed and studied for many years, but this is our first plan that actually has been approved and is a part of St. Louis County's general plan. But that is for the commercial corridor along Bellefontaine. But we definitely have to look at the wealth and the health of our community members.
Thank you very much for that, Angela. You definitely have a unique situation that you're working with up in Spanish Lake. So what I'd like to do next is I'm going to go to each of our 5 panelists with a specific question. I'm going to ask the other 4 panelists, if you've got something to add on one of these, just wait till we get through all these 5, but feel free to add at that point. I just want to dig in a little deeper on some of these specific situations that we're seeing. So Vontriece, we're going to start with you. Now, as someone who works directly with these neighborhoods, and maybe you can talk a little bit about exactly what your role is at Invest NTL, STL. Can you talk also a little bit about the balance you have to find between support and advice on one hand and allowing neighborhoods to find their own voice on the other? What are those lessons that you've learned in the process of supporting these neighborhoods?
Thank you, Wally. And no pressure, Angela, thank you. I'm going to start first with the mission of our organization at Invest STL, because I think that would explain how we move, how we show up, or why we show up the way we do and where we choose to go. So Invest STL facilitates investment in the power of people and their neighborhoods to develop communities of justice and opportunity in places that continue to endure the legacy of systemic anti-Black racism. So when I hear your question, Wally, and I think about voice and allowing community to find their voice, we don't move in that way at Invest STL. We're not allowing, the voice is there. I think that's very clear for the panel, and folks have been speaking and sharing their needs and their wants for their community for years. One of the things that we talk about at Invest STL and we're trying to address is that shift in power and who's listening to that voice, or who's choosing to lean in, and how institutions are responding, right? And so my role as a neighborhood solidarity partner for folks who are in funding may traditionally be like a grant manager or a project manager of some sort, but we don't want to move in that traditional way. And that title is very intentional. We want to work in partnership with our funders. And so Annissa and Trina, Dutchtown, Cornerstone, West End are our current investees. And I think they can speak to how we're moving. But we like to lean in, and we want to get our hands dirty and get in the weeds with our investees and understand what are the challenges, right? Yes, the funding is there, but what are the challenges with executing your visions and your dreams for your community, for your organization? And we want to help solve those challenges and maybe find other resources and consultants that can help lean in, and there not be any punishment, right? Or next year, we're not going to renew the funding because you were dealing with a challenge, but how can we lean in and actually address those? And so with that being said, some of the things that I have learned and the organization I think has learned is with this new innovative approach, right? There's some unlearning, right? We've been going through this process of unlearning and wanting to move differently as an investor, right? But there are also our investees, right, have to unlearn how funders have traditionally partnered with them. And I see Monique Thomas in the chat, and we're always very transparent with the growth that we've gone through. And she's the executive director of Cornerstone Corporation and CDC and the anchor organization in the West End. And initially coming into this role, I'm like, yes, I'm here. Tell me all your dirty secrets and I want to help. And she's like, hold on, you're our funder. We're not doing that. And so learning how to build that trusting relationship. Monique said she was not having it. And we always talk about how this work moves at the speed of trust. And this is like a true, legit example. And I know that for being in community engagement for so long, but you always have to be reminded. So I'm coming in with this new, shiny, exciting, innovative approach through Invest STL. And Monique is like, let's slow down, because I need to understand if you're really who you say you are. And so building that trust and taking a step back was something that we've learned. I would say too, also the investment in people, right? And not just the physical of a community, right? Not just investing in the new buildings and the new sidewalks, right? How do we invest in the people and the civic capacity of the people and the understanding? Our role is to really sit back and observe those challenges, those ideas, and those visions, and then figure out, when, because you talk about that balance. It is a tricky balance, especially coming in with a community engagement background, right? I may see some challenges and want to fix it. And I share all the time that I'm the oldest of 6 children. So when you're the oldest, you're used to just fixing everything. And having to step back and really observe and watch as the residents begin to do all their own problem solving. They have all of the answers, right? So the voice is there. It's how we're leaning in, how we're choosing to listen. And Invest SEL is trying to be that liaison where we're not just listening, but we're trying to prepare the ecosystem to really listen and lean in. Another thing that I think I've learned, and I also will have to credit my experience and my position at Alive and Well Communities and understanding trauma and the impact of trauma, is really, really observing how, and what Trina mentioned is not just that racism, but that historical trauma, which Ms. Allen has already spoken to, and how that not just impacts the community, but it impacts the individuals in the community. It has an impact on their trust, not just the trust of me representing a funder or institution and community development, but also it impacts how they trust and lean in with one another. So that was a really eye-opening experience that I think I would not have been able to really see if I had not had that trauma training. And so now working with the residents to figure out how to begin to build that trust and lean in. And I have to credit the Black Healers Collective for being a resource that we can tap into that will, starting next month, partner with the residents of the West End in some of that work.
Thank you, Vontriece. You all have fans in the audience based on the chat, and there are incredible questions popping up there already. So I'm going to work my way through these so we can get to those from the audience. So Annissa, I'm going to move to you next. Your organization's been working on a big project for a few years now. Can you talk a little about the Gravois Jefferson Historic Neighborhoods Plan, what it took to pull that plan together between several neighborhoods, and what role that plan is playing in development now?
So first and foremost, our Gravois Jefferson liaison, Jemay, is in this presentation as well as the chair of our development review committee, which came out of the plan. So the Gravois Jefferson Historic Neighborhoods Plan is our comprehensive plan for our catchment. It is the voice of the people in terms of how they would like to see things developed. What are the priorities in things that they would like to have done? You know, in urban planning, in community planning, there needs to be a plan. There needs to be something that was done. And unfortunately, the city of St. Louis did not have that for the neighborhoods that we touch. And because of the size of the city, it just wasn't possible. So the process actually began in like 2015, 2016, and then was adopted by the city of St. Louis in 2018. It actually was a collaboration with our partners. Lutheran Development had a voice in it, Tower Grove CDC, as well as the Sales Community Development, in partnership, recognizing that they overlap and they touch our catchment. And so as we go, that would impact them. So they served as advisory, as partners in that development, and RISE STL gave the technical assistance in the creation of the plan. In doing so, it was very important that there were representatives from all the neighborhoods of our catchment present and participating and giving voice to this. So there were workshops, there were, for lack of a better term, charrettes that occurred throughout the catchment, and there was a consistent committee that worked for the creation of this document. In the creation of the document, we now have a plan, right? So what do you do with the plan? You implement. And one of the things that was definitely necessary is there had not been a voice, and we still struggle to make sure that we have the voice in how things are done, how things are developed, what goes where, and who puts it there, and what is the resource available to make sure that the community has a voice. So out of that plan came the Gravois Jefferson plan, the Gravois Jefferson Development Review Committee, I'm sorry. With that committee, we have representatives from the catchment, and they are available and they've been trained to review plans, to ask questions of developers, to see how it works against the checklist that was created from the plan. The thing I want to point out about our Gravois Jefferson plan, our development review committee, all of those things, they came out of our community empowerment committee. We have a subcommittee of our organization that is made up of the community. And one of the things that they said is, we want a plan. We want to have the ability to have a voice. And so the funds were found, the resources were developed, the plan was implemented, and now we have this review committee that seeks to actively have voice. We seek to have partnership with developers. So far, in my time being there, after having the training done shortly before I started in June, the committee has reviewed 2 developments that were both affordable housing proposals, one of which was in the pot that was just recently approved by the Affordable Housing Trust Fund that would cause redevelopment and development of new, as well as rehab of some properties specifically for those who need it the most. We have a large population of veterans in our community that need to have housing that can't afford the housing that's on the market. So we see these things happening, we're having these partnerships, but the question is, and what we're struggling with, is how do we ensure that it's not just the people who buy the vision, it's not just the people who actively participate with us and partner with us, how do we ensure that we have those who want to develop on a larger scale outside of our circle of influence typically to come to us? And so that's the next phase of what we're reaching for. That's the next phase of what we're seeking to have. And we have partnerships that are seeking to bring those people to the table with us. The alders are important. They're very important. Having that relationship and having them familiar enough with the plan that they can say, have you spoken to Dutchtown South and their development review committee? Because if that doesn't happen, then we can go and talk in circles and do all these other things. But unless we have the buy-in and the teeth and the partnerships at levels beyond what we are as a community organization, it's just a pretty plan that people are using as an example to create other pretty plans.
I appreciate that point very much. Trina, I think I'm going to come to you next, because especially that last theme that Annissa left off there in terms of once you have a plan, how do you actually get developers, government agents kind of to pay attention to it? You're a resident who stepped into neighborhood leadership role. Can you talk a little bit about the learning curve of empowering a neighborhood and getting the powers that be to listen to those voices? What have been your successes and cautionary tales?
Oh gosh, I could talk for hours about that. Where do I start? So a couple of things that I was thinking as Vontriece kind of laid out Invest STL's mission and vision for their work and how they lean into this work. I want to also point out that they didn't start that way. And so they have gone through a internal process where they've decided to show up differently, although they weren't created necessarily to show up in this way. And so one example I really want to put out there in terms of Vontriece is not just talk and like how they have actually showed up for us has been, we have been engaging in a community planning process now for well over 3 years. I did not start this process and expecting to still be doing this right now. But it was mainly because at some point, residents that were engaged in this, including myself and others, felt like how it was being done didn't feel right. There were certain things that for some felt like it was like a cookie cutter approach, mirroring what other plans were looking like. And there were those of us that also just kind of felt there wasn't enough, there weren't enough resources being poured into effective strategy, like how do you employ effective strategies for engagement? Like a real good facilitator goes a long way. I cannot stress enough the importance of good facilitation skills when you're talking about raising community voice, and because you need to be able to hear, right? And you need to be able to see people and understand what they're saying, but you need to also take that and incorporate it into the work. Otherwise, you're just pacifying, right? So one thing that happened for us is then a group decided, our steering committee in particular for the plan was like, wait, we can't continue doing things this way. So we took a break, a pause, just so happened during the same time as the pandemic. So, right, so a lot of people rethought their jobs. We rethought the way we were planning. And we were able to say Invest STL showed up in this way. They heard us say this isn't working for us. And instead of saying, but you have a timeline and you got to spend these funds by X number, by this date, they said, how can we help? And they brought in a facilitator to help us figure out a process that would feel and execution actually be resident led, because we had a group of residents that decided, we don't want to advise on this. We don't want you to give us information and we either nod our heads or ask a couple questions, but we actually want to lead this process. And Invest SDL allowed for us to do that pause. And not only that, they walked with us. They got into the trenches with us and helped us really figure out what was going to be the best path forward. And that is something that I think was transformational when you think about trust and you think about how people regard institutions when you think about these neighborhoods. And so it was really a transformational moment for not only Invest SDL, but also for our neighborhood. So all that said, I think the importance of relationship building and actually listening, seeing residents, realizing that, there's the phrase, the people that are closest to the problems are the ones with the best solutions, or the ones most likely to offer the best solutions. And that's really been our approach. I was also going to mention too, that out of this process, there are certain things that we did that we could immediately respond to community voice. And that also is a good way to keep people engaged. And that was, we didn't wait until the plan to do a development review committee. In our early sessions with residents, when we were just introducing the process and how we're going to try to engage folks, the one thing that we had a listening session at one point where people could just speak. It was no agenda. It was just people could speak during this process and at the beginning of this process. And a lot of folks were really concerned that while we're planning, other folks are going to be doing things in our neighborhood. So, we can kind of get with this planning thing, but how do we do that and not let folks come in and continue to do what they've been doing without our input? And so the Development Review Committee was a tool that we thought would be good to allow for us to partner with. So the West End represents like 3 wards. And so for the first time, we got all 3 alderpersons to sign a letter committing to partnering with the DRC. And in that partnership, they were with any developer that's needing a variance on something, or a liquor license, or an application to the state for public funding, anything that they were needing aldermanic support for, the alderpersons all agreed to send them through the DRC first if that development was taking place in the West End and Visitation Park. And there's been some, ups and downs and a lot of lessons learned even through that. But I think it's just another example, though, of listening to what residents are saying, even in the midst of this process, and finding those small wins so that we can keep moving, but at the same time, filling in some of the gaps as we move towards establishing this shared vision for our neighborhood. I felt like I was kind of all over the place, but I think I answered your question. If not,
I think so too, and many more. A wealth of information. I think, especially for folks that are just getting a sense of what it means to empower our community, there's a lot of great information here. So speaking of things just getting going, Angela, I'm going to come to you next. As someone representing an unincorporated area, right? Not a municipality, it's kind of created by the census in some ways.
Census designated place.
That's right. So what does it take to highlight a community, to try to create that community where maybe people didn't quite see it that way before? Or are you, surfacing something that's always been there, but just hasn't been as explicit? Like, what does it take for a small organization to uplift a community that maybe hasn't seen itself as such?
Well, so Spanish Lake has been, we have a number of assessments, like I said before, a number of studies. And what was always noted is the lack of sense of place. limited community cohesion. There's no place that the residents would identify as the heart of the community. I'm para-quoting some of the things that we've seen in these studies and assessments. So it's a wonder, I mean, it's no wonder why most people in Spanish Lake, many, I shouldn't say most, many people in Spanish Lake identify more with their subdivision or with their church or even their apartment complex that's not Spanish Lake. So the work that the newest activity at the CDC is that master land use plan that we talked about, that I talked about before. And actually that planning process was designed to go deep and to touch all of our stakeholders, our renters, our homeowners, our business folks, single women, family-led households, to build those blocks and to create a sense of place. And that area, that commercial corridor would again become the heart of Spanish Lake. We still struggle though with folks not really even knowing that the CDC has been around for about almost 8 years. And we still struggle with that. Like, what is the CDC and what does it do? So actually earlier conversations that I've had with Vontriece and some other community engagement professionals is that we have to go where the people are. Many times we were sending our information. Hey, we're having a meeting, send it to Hazelwood, the school district, through their email blast. But if they don't see you and if they don't connect with you, then they won't attend your meetings. So we look at each individual stakeholder that we have, and we go to where they are. We develop these type of strategic partnerships with the child care center so we can talk to so we can send information and have that kind of connection with the child care owners, because they have that direct line with those parents, or the social workers at the Hazelwood School District, because we have some information or whatever that we need to share. Trina, you said something about development review committee. And, one of the questions that, that may come up is, how do we handle these developers and coming into our community and doing kind of whatever that they, whatever they please. And as an unincorporated community, that happens a lot. So we have to say that we have to keep that line of communication open with our local representatives. And once again, because we are unincorporated, we do not have that one layer of government or a dedicated representative for Spanish Lake, but we have to keep those layers of communication open. And I tell you, we have a community, I call her community champion. She may even be on, her name is Cookie. And she, goes around and talks with the people one-on-one at the Schnucks Market. And that is how, because we have a large percentage of folks that are seniors. They're not online, but they still need that information. So each individual step, we have to plug in to where the people are. Wherever they are, that's where we try to plug in. I hope I answered the question.
I believe so. Thank you. Thank you very much. So Julia, we're gonna come back to you. Your neighborhood, I mean, the Ville has played an outsized role in especially the history of Black St. Louis, between educating most Black healthcare professionals from the late part of the 20th century to the first Black high school west of the Mississippi. And you've laid out a little of that history. And as we said, that history can be a source of trauma for our communities. It can also be a resource. So just like to get you to talk a little bit about, given that history that you have, what role is that history playing today in how you're working to build up the Ville?
The history of For the Ville is basically our foundation, because there is such great history in the neighborhood. One of the things that we believe is that the legacy of the Ville can be leveraged to create new opportunities in the community and build community power. We've experienced a lot of the things that my other panelists have talked about. We don't necessarily have one organization that is actually representing a way to solve all those problems that my fellow panelists have talked about. So we're leveraging our history. So the first thing we had to do was to reclaim our history and to make sure the region does not forget our history, or the neighborhood that holds the history. Because a lot of times when a neighborhood like ours, there's a lot of great history here, but sometimes that history is exploited. And if people aren't educated to know and understand what that history is, what that history means, not just to the city of St. Louis and its African-American population, but on the national level, because our neighborhood has been associated with a lot of historic civil rights cases, like Shelley versus Kramer, that case. So, you know, we're monopolizing on our history. So that's what we're doing. And I guess my perspective is, I've been here for 72 years. I've had experience with most of the institutions that are now closed, which have been designated as historical. I live here, I worship here. And this neighborhood and the history for me is so precious. It needs to be shared. And we need to educate, because there are still a lot of people in the city of St. Louis, old, young, white, black, green, purple, who do not understand the history and the historic significance of this neighborhood. So we're working on what we call community tourism. So basically what For the Ville does is we provide tours for anybody who's interested in learning about the history. And so we leverage that against other things that we'd like to see in our neighborhood happen through our partnerships and our collaborations. So we basically we do tours for young, old, white, black, pink, purple, it doesn't matter. Organizations, we've done tours for schools. We've had people come from outside of the St. Louis area, from Florida, from Ohio, who have come to learn about the history. So we're trying to leverage that history in order to bring about community development and change in our neighborhood. One of the things that's kind of, everybody mentioned about vacancy rates and all of that. Our ward has the largest vacancy rate in the city of St. Louis. And to see nothing going on in our neighborhood, it just, for me, I take it personal. Okay, this is a personal thing for me, and and it's like I'm trying to be a gatekeeper, but I also have the people on For the Ville who are like-minded people, young and old, who are fighting for the same thing, and that's for the historic preservation of what's left here, of the buildings, of the people who have contributed to the history, the recognition that this place is important in the development of the city of St. Louis. Even though, people come in and say, oh my God, look at this neighborhood, there could no way possibly be any resources or any good coming out of this neighborhood. But believe me, if you say the Ville, I guarantee you that somebody either grew up, was born at Homer G. Phillips Hospital, have relatives or something that can be linked back to the Ville. So we're taking advantage of our history. And the thing that has really made me excited is that we've been able to form different kinds of partnerships within and outside of the St. Louis community. We've worked with the Missouri History Museum and Missouri Historical Society. We've worked with Shakespeare in the streets. Just recently this summer, they put on a play in the streets in the neighborhood about Sumner High School. Who does that? We've worked with TrailNet, the Greenway Project. We also were instrumental in the film company coming here to film The Color of Medicine. We've worked with the Vashon and Garrett Museums, the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services, Washington University Sam Cooke School of Architecture, at the George Brown School of Social Work, Sweet Auburn Works in Atlanta, and the Historic African Neighborhoods and District Society. So like I said, we're playing on our history. And one thing that I am very proud of that Fartherville has accomplished is that we were recently awarded the African American Cultural African American Cultural Heritage Fund grant for $150,000 from the National Trust for the Historic Preservation to continue to build our capacity. So, you know, there are many ways that you can build community, and there are many ways that you can address racial inequalities, racial disinvestment. So like I said, we're using our history because that's our strong suit.
Thank you so much for that impassioned presentation, because yeah, that history is a huge resource. So the resources that you have are one thing, the hurdles you have to jump and the barriers you all face when you're trying to do this is another. So I'm going to ask one more question for the full panel, and then we're going to get to audience member questions. I'd like you to talk, and whoever wants to speak in on this, of the role of elected officials in enabling neighborhood self-determination. How can alder people inside of the city, council people out in the county, help or hurt efforts at hyper-local self-determination? We're also facing ward reduction here in the city. If you want to talk a little bit about how that might affect your work. So just that engagement with government and elected officials, like how does that work? What do you need? What do they need to know and understand?
I want to jump in real quick on this one. So the thing I think about immediately when you said that is, I thought, you know, it's necessary. It's crucial to the work, especially with our local officials. Starting with our aldermanic support, it is crucial. The fact that development can happen in your ward without you even knowing about it. When I think about what I've been in the West End now for 11 years, and what brought me to the table to this work was sitting in too many meetings where we're lamenting over something that is a done deal. It's a development that's coming in, people have opinions about it, and it does not matter. The ink is dry, it's done. And a lot of it is publicly funded projects. So, you know, you do need to have, I think it's absolutely required to get it to be able to move. You have to have the support of your alderpersons. But the challenge that we have though is when a lot of these funds for developments, particularly like for tax credit LIHTC projects, low income tax credit projects, it's the state that's awarding those dollars, right? The state has no clue what's going on the local level. We have had projects that have been funded where they've got everything checked off. They got the letters of support they need, but the community voice still isn't there because the letter, I kid you not, and I'm not even gonna throw out names here, but I will say that, you know, we've had an issue where a project was funded that had letters of support from, I think, 12 different neighborhoods for a project to happen in the West End. Not one letter of support from an organization or entity in the West End. And it was funded because all they had to check on when they reviewed the application is that they had the letters of support. Because when you think on the state level, they're not looking at addresses saying, well, you know, I think you ought to be required to have a map that pinpoints for every letter of support you have, show a pinpoint where those people are, because it makes no sense to me that you can go 5, 6 neighborhoods, east of our neighborhood to get a letter of support, and that's considered community voice. That's ridiculous. So I'm sorry, I'm a little passionate about that one, but I will say that, so it is very important to have the elected officials, and you start by building relationships. I do think that it's easier to form relationships when you have a smaller footprint. The fact that I know for us, and I would imagine for everybody else, there, with the decrease in the number of wards, the footprint has expanded. For some folks, maybe even tripled. I have no idea what that's going to look like in terms of engagement, in terms of relationship building with your alderperson. But I'm hopeful that with this redistricting, people will actually get out and start and vote, that we demand something different, even in the way people run for these offices, so that they feel more accountable from the jump. Because the thing is, you can have a DRC, a Development Review Committee, that is heavily relying on the support of your alderperson. You get a new alderperson in, they don't have to work with you. Without that relationship, you got a voice, but you have very little power.
And I want to piggyback off of what Trina is talking about, because I think even with the number of wards that we have, we don't necessarily hold our elected officials accountable. And it's about accountability. And it's about, we vote, we put them in office. They owe us. We don't owe them anything. And you have to hold them accountable, because if you don't hold them accountable, it's just like Trina said, they'll get all the check marks off. You don't know what's going on. And then there you are stuck. They have to start listening to the community, asking the questions in the community. What does the community want to see in their neighborhood? They just can't keep doing the same things over and over again. And it's just so important, because you got to worry about the impact of whatever they vote on and how it's going to impact the people who live in these neighborhoods and our communities and stuff. And I, with the voting thing, I usually, whenever I'm talking to people, I tell them, look, make sure you know who you are voting for. What is their body of work? Look at their voting record and say with the Board of Aldermen. I mean, look at the type of legislation that they've supported. And you have to be, we keep saying it over and over again, you have to be educated and engaged in some form or manner in order to make sure your representatives are accountable and how they interact with the community, because the community voice is so very important. We can't keep doing business as usual. We have to, we're stepping up now, and they are accountable to us. We are not accountable to them. I'm done.
I want to add that in addition to holding them accountable, you have to be, as an organization, tuned in and accountable to the people that you're saying that you serve. You have to know what their voice is saying. You have to engage with them, and you have to not be fearful of then engaging on their behalf. And when you do so with clarity, and you do so with the power and understanding that you have their backing. If you're afraid to speak to the people that represent your organization's catchment or the area that you're servicing, then you're really not servicing those individuals. You have to find a means to have relationship, and also to stand in the authority of what people have entrusted you to do. And with that authority, also understand that you have a responsibility to have the hard discussions with the catchment, to make sure that they are educated as to what the issues are, and then let them make the decision and take the charge forward. Because if you only are having and concentrating on the relationship with those elected officials who truly work for us and are supposed to be working on our behalf, but you're not having the conversation with the community and aren't clear on what they want, then it's really not representation, which is what we're saying we're doing. And that's a key component that we need to ensure is included when we're engaging these elected officials, that we are also having the conversation and have a background to speak on behalf of who we say we represent as community organizations.
You just gave yourself a very difficult job. And as you just described how hard that middle role is. Yeah, absolutely. Angela.
Yeah, I just like to add something just really quick. Our local representative is a district, a councilwoman, Shalonda Webb, and she serves more than just Spanish Lake. She has some of Blackjack and a huge chunk of Florissant and Castle Point and Glasgow Village, even other unincorporated communities. So we keep a close relationship with her and of course her staff, but a lot of our relationships are directly with the department in the county. People leave, they are there, the guards change, and we were actually, we experienced that when the guards changed in North County. And because of that, so the support that we do receive from St. Louis County is program specific. So if we're not active, and so as far as the CDC is concerned, it's housing. So if we're not actively participating in a particular project or a housing project, that funding source isn't there. So when you have an organization such as the CDC, where our activities are centered around all of Spanish Lake and the community renewal for the entire community, these really kind of broad buckets, housing, commercial and economic development, and community engagement. In order for us to survive, we have to prospect operating funds outside of Spanish Lake and outside the community. And that is pretty difficult and somewhat very limiting, because if you find a funding source that is, they have to have that special tie to Spanish Lake. So that, those are some of the challenges. So when we talked about challenges, that is, what we experience. We have many supporters in the county. Each of those departments, whatever they can do, however they can assist us, they will. But how we're set up and structured in the county, unlike the city, a lot of the aldermen and they use the Black grant dollars to fund the operating support of some of their community organizations, or at least a portion of it. The county is not set up for that. So that becomes a challenge for unincorporated communities in St. Louis County.
Thank you, Angela. Okay, well, we have lots and lots of questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but Monique from Cornerstone threw us a zinger right up top, a tough one. We've been talking about equity. We've been talking about community engagement. What is your working definition of equitable community engagement? Now, I think we've got one candidate for an answer already, right? Where was it? Angela, you said, go where the people are. I think that's maybe a good place to start. But what else does equitable community engagement mean to you all?
Actually, through our planning process, we first identified the stakeholders, the people who would inform this type of development. And I hear you, Trina, when you say that these things, you turn around, the ink is dry, the deal is done, and no one has had an opportunity to say a word. And that's why it's important, the value of the CDC, because we try to be the voice of the people. And even with what we felt was a deeply engaged community engagement process, we still heard from 75–80% of homeowners, even though most of the community They were renters. Because so that's a mind shift change. And that is something, so I would be the first to say, so not that I don't necessarily have an answer for it, it's just that we are still working to change the mind shift of some of our renters, but because it's our fault. Historically, no one has asked them. So when it comes up, they don't feel a part of the process. It's transitional to them. Yeah. So we're improving some bus stops in Spanish Lake. So we will go to the the apartment complexes and sit down and go to where they are. And that's the, that's what we have to do.
I think to kind of carry on what Angela was saying, not just going where the people are, but knowing who the people are. This was actually a question that I received as I was being interviewed for my position. And the answer is, it's not always the loudest person. It's not always the largest group. Right. And being able to have the resources and the partnerships in the community who can point you over to Miss So-and-so over on the side who knows everybody, everything, and can give you an earful, and then point you to so-and-so around the corner who can be really good on your committee. They're a little shy, but if you work with them enough, they'll come on through. So you go to where those people are, but you also have to constantly be looking at and shifting your view of who the people are that you're trying to engage, because we're all talking about neighborhoods in transition, right? It's going to change, which means that we have to continually create relationships with different people, with different organizations, not be afraid to do that, and understand that they may not be the partner for everything you do, but they may get you a portion of the way you need to go, and then someone else may pick up where they left off.
Yeah, and I want to add to that.
Understanding that you have to have relationships with some of everybody and not close yourself off with the idea of who everybody should be.
I want to add to that from a perspective of one of the things that I learned at the Neighborhood Fellows Leadership Program is that we have no representation on boards and commissions. And we have to get on these boards and commissions so our voices can be heard. And if you go to the boards and commissions website and you look at it, there aren't a lot of people from our communities on those boards or commissions. And if you all take a closer look, there are a lot of people on those boards and commissions whose terms have termed out, but they're still serving on those boards. And it goes back to what Annissa, is that how you say it? I'm sorry. Annissa was saying about not being afraid to step up to the plate and ask your alderman or your state representative to give you a letter of recommendation to sit on some of these boards. And if we need that kind of representation on the local and state level, because a lot of times our voices just don't reach those kinds of levels to be heard. And we need to do that. It's really important. It's to me, it's part of the entire process. It's part of the entire process, and it's part of growing the process. It's part of not being afraid to step up and to tell your story, because nobody else has lived your story but you. And this is a way to get other people to maybe listen and say, wow, I didn't know that, or either start to establish a relationship with you and your community.
The other thing too that I want to be very careful about when we talk about how we get residents to feel more comfortable being engaged and to know that their voice is valued and therefore use it, is that and this is a social work background. So often in just the history of social work, it's been about fixing people. So you have these systemic issues, but it's like, well, if you could only do this, or if you could fix this about yourself, then maybe the system will work better for you. I think we're in a position with neighborhoods and the work that we're doing. And I think about Cornerstone in a way that we've even evolved as this emerging CDC, and how we show up in a room is recognizing that sometimes we need to co-create new systems, as opposed to saying to folks, you just need to go to the meeting. Well, there's some people that don't like going to meetings, don't feel comfortable in meetings, and don't have the time. I don't care how much childcare you provide, or if you provide a meal, it's not, I think for those of us where that's just a part of our daily life, we're in meetings all the time, it's different, it feels different for different people. And I think we have to really think about redefining even engagement. And it would have to be unique for every neighborhood, of course, but what does that look like? Because traditionally it's a survey, or it's a neighborhood meeting of some type. But when you're talking about actually going and being on the front porch with somebody who then can connect you to somebody here and somebody there, it requires a lot of patience, right? It requires a lot of willingness to develop those relationships. But I guarantee you the quality of work that comes out of that will be so much better than the status quo. And the status quo is, like Angie said, we had the same issue where most of the people that showed up in the room, they're the homeowners, because there's a direct benefit to homeowners, right? When you have these conversations. But when you talk about renters, I lived in the West End as a renter years ago, as a student. I guarantee you I was there for different reasons than I am there now, with my family. So you need to touch me in a different way. I'm not going to come to a neighborhood meeting. I'm not going to, and surveys are limited, right? They're only as great as the person that designed it. So it's like, I do think we have to really rethink what engagement looks like and be willing to co-create those systems within our neighborhood. And I think that's what leads to equitable development, in my opinion. I think it starts there.
Wally, can I add just 20 seconds or less? I also think when we say we're trying to reach folks that aren't always engaged, don't assume that they don't care because they're not showing up or responding to your survey, and be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And so I know that's my brother Justin in the chat talking about going to the trap, right? And some of us might hear that terminology and get uncomfortable and say, oh no, I don't understand it, so I'm not going to lean into it. And if that's the case, you're going to continue to get the same folks, the usual suspects, responding to your survey and sitting at their table. The other thing to understand that Black folk ain't a monolith, right? And so if a community is majority Black and you have a few folks at the table, that doesn't represent all of the voices in the community. And so I remember we just recently, we did an engagement project, and some residents was called every name in the book but a child of God, right? And what we did, Trina laughing, but it happened, right? And what we had to do with our planning partner, our planning team, is say, we're capturing that. That's real feedback. Because the final question, after all of that name calling and all that frustration, the final question asks, what do you want to see in your community? And the shared voice was, we want a safe, beautiful community for ourselves, for our kids, and for our neighbors. And whether you were angry or not, a renter or not, they all had the shared vision. And so also, being able to be uncomfortable, being willing to be uncomfortable, and then leaning into that stuff that you don't know and that you're not familiar with. So.
Thank you. I'm going to move right on to the next question just because we have lots of questions and next to no time. And this brings up a couple of things that we've talked about a little bit. A question from the Q&A. I know from community mediations that a lot of residents are frustrated with large out-of-town investors who do not properly supervise and attend their rentals. Are there groups of smaller local investors who can pool their resources and or focus on a specific area for improvements? Which is a really interesting idea, that the organizations don't just review projects other people are proposing, but possibly actively go upstream and try to spawn those projects themselves with the partners they want instead of taking the partners as they come. So any thoughts on that, Annissa?
It's a matter of what we've been discussing in our catchment. So one of the ideas is, yes, that is possible, but we have to have possession and influence over the properties that are available for redevelopment. So we work with Legal Services of Eastern Missouri on their vacant housing initiative. And with that, we've been able to go to court and turn over properties to trusted individuals for redevelopment. But that's piecemeal, and that's an individual property at a time, as opposed to having the mass impact of being able to group parcels together, go out for RFP, and do development on a larger scale. That is what needs to happen. That is what is going to shift and make our neighborhood stable, to be able to provide affordable and safe and clean housing for either rental or for sale. It's not an either or proposition, because some people don't want and are just not ready to own. And some people want to own, but are finding that it's nearly impossible to do so in the city. So there has to be a means to allow these small groups to come together and do these redevelopments, or to be able to get the funding. Because what you will find is, for most cases, I have 3 full-time employees. It's very difficult for my organization to get funded to do a large-scale affordable housing development, even though that is something that we would like to do, without partnership. So finding those abilities to create those partnerships, but also being able to get possession and have influence over the properties that need to be grouped together in order to have this development. And that's something that has to come from a mindset and a pay grade higher than mine. They have to buy into it and trust the community to be able to make this happen, because the community talks about it, the community wants it to happen, but the trust and the influence to allow us to do that has not yet occurred. And that's something that we are now fighting for, I would say, in most of our organizations.
Thank you for that, Annissa. Anybody else on that front? Okay, so I'm going to pull a couple of other questions. There's one question that says, there must be a sign that says only affordable housing in communities north of Del Mar. How do we set that narrative? We can't become thriving communities with only one type of housing being funded and development north of Del Mar.
So that's my neighbor. Thank you, Justin. And Justin is Justin sits on our development review committee for our neighborhoods. And I will say the last 6 months, we meet monthly. The projects have all been affordable housing projects, like publicly funded affordable housing projects, which tend to be very competitive. And with them being very competitive, those that have a greater percentage of serving low income as opposed to market rate are most likely to be funded, right? So it's not really encouraged to have it truly be mixed income housing. And that becomes one of the challenges, particularly in a neighborhood where oftentimes the issue around affordable housing has been how that housing has historically been managed. Although conversations can easily creep into the people that live there and we start criminalizing poverty, the issues have been really around how those buildings have been managed and the lack of investment after that initial funding, right? So, it is a major problem. And again, I think that's a policy issue. I do think that there has to be some willingness to support and invest in affordable housing projects where you're not creating areas where it's concentrated poverty. That's what it ends up being. So we've historically learned from Pruitt-Igoe and other things, all these other developments, and we say we're learning, we got all these documentaries about them, but then at the policy level, we're still trying to pull for the same stuff. And it's very frustrating. for a group of neighbors to try to understand why is it that, what is it about this neighborhood that everybody wants to come here and build these type of projects. So I do think it's a policy issue, which makes it an advocacy issue when you think about action on our parts to really try to change that piece. But I love the idea of, and it has come up in our DRC, like, how can we bring developers here as opposed to continue to just wait for folks to come with these projects? And I don't have the answer. That's why I was silent and let Annissa do all the talking on that, because I don't know. Even when the question came up in the DRC, and it was crickets, because where do you start? You know, and our DRC is made up of, although we're all residents, it's some developers on there. There are, you know, people that work for the city. There, I mean, people from various walks of life, and we don't have a clue where to start on something like that. But I do see the value of being able to vet beforehand. You choose who's doing something great someplace, and how do we go out and find them and ask them to come to our neighborhood, walk around this neighborhood with us, and help us figure out a strategy for dealing with all of the vacancy that we have and the LRA properties that we still have in our neighborhood. I think it's beautiful. I just don't know if anybody is in this audience that has any clue to that. Please let us know.
Thank you. Anybody else on that question?
So we deal with vacancy. So there's about 23% vacancy in Spanish Lake. And most of our community, of course, they're single family homes. And Spanish Lake is historically a farming community. So we have every type of house that you could imagine. We have ranch and bungalow. We have little 900 square foot houses, frame houses on 3 acres of land. So, you know, we have all of that. And what we historically have been seeing is the reason why we have such a high percentage rate of even rentals, that our housing stock is still fairly good. So it attracts outside investors, but there's no watchdog, if you will, to even bank some of these properties. So what we're working with Legal Services of Eastern Missouri now is another reason why the county is a little different from the city. If there's a tax foreclosure, the county doesn't take title to these properties. And many times if an investor wants to purchase this property, they purchase it with all of the liens and all of the encumbrances on the property. So it is not, so if you have a good investor who really wants to transform the community, they have those types of problems and challenges. And so hopefully we can work with Legal Services of Eastern Missouri to try to bank some of these properties so we can control the different communities in North County, whether it be Spanish Lake, Glasgow, or some of the communities in that 24-1 footprint, that they can plan their community renewal, their housing around that, and be able to take title to some of these projects. And like Annissa said, we can work with Legal Services, but it's kind of a piece by piece, parcel by parcel, without really able to make an impact. So it is very evident to see that, you know, we all have a lot of work to do as we are representing the people in our communities.
Thank you, Angela. So at this point, I am going to ask one more question, but also while this question is being answered, I just want to point out that in the chat, we have lots of folks asking how they can get connected, how they can help. We've got someone from Corey Bush's office. We've got someone that wants to take a tour of the Ville. So I just want to invite the panelists, if you're comfortable with that, to put any connection or contact information that you'd like in the chat for audience members to connect with you. And I also want to offer that I'm happy to connect folks afterwards. But for this last about 2 minutes that we've got, I've got one more question. We've been talking a lot about ownership versus renters, and Stephen has a question. Is there a third option besides individual own-occupied versus rental units, collective ownership without a profit motive? And Annissa, you pointed to something in the chat. I didn't know if you wanted to expand on that just a little bit.
There is, there's the ability to create co-ops, land banks, land trusts, all of those things. But for some reason, they haven't really taken shape in St. Louis. I give the analogy that my son is 17, and I remember going to an APA seminar before he was ever thought of. And this exact thing was discussed as a way to create sustainable neighborhoods that were affordable, maintained, provided everything that we needed to provide and what we want to have to create a home-like atmosphere in the city. And yet we still have not gotten to the point where these things have really taken hold and taken shape. There is that middle ground, but we haven't really developed or gone into the mindset of creating this additional opportunity for housing that is sustainable, that is stable, and creates anchors in our neighborhoods.
Okay. Thank you. And yeah, that's a really wide door that we just opened up right at the end of this conversation, because there is a whole lot of possibility there and a whole lot of complexity to some of those answers. But there are other systems, to bring it back to your point, Trina. Instead of fitting people to systems, there are other systems that we can fit onto these communities. With that, unfortunately, I have to say that we are pretty much at the end of our time. I see folks sharing their email in the chat. I appreciate that. I really, really want to extend a warm thank you to all of our panelists, Julia, Trina, Angela, Vontriece, and Annissa. This has been incredibly informative. Thank you all so much for being willing to share your time and expertise. And thanks to the audience for being with us today. Also, one more big thank you to the Incarnate Word Foundation for supporting these free community forums that we get to put on. And finally, a last plug, please be sure if you are like these kinds of forums and conversations, check out focusstl.com.org and become a member, and you will find out more about what we are doing. And with that, we're going to hand everybody back their day. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a fantastic rest of the week. Thanks, everybody.